Hi, I'd like to continue with Brian's Winter. This is chapter 2. For 2 weeks, the weather grew warmer, and each day was more glorious than the one before. Hunting seemed to get better as well. Brian took fool birds or rabbits every day, and on one single day, he took 3 fool birds. He ate everything, and he felt fat and lazy, and one afternoon, he actually just laid in the sun. It was perhaps wrong to say he was happy. He spent too much time in loneliness for true happiness. But he found himself smiling as he worked around the camp and actually looked forward to bringing in wood in the soft afternoons. It um, just because it kept him out of rummaging around in the woods. He had made many friends, or at least acquaintances. Birds had taken a special significance on for Brian. At night, the owls made their soft sounds, calling each other in almost a ghostly "ooh" sound or whatever scared him whoo, until he finally saw one call on a night when the moon was full and so bright it was almost like a cloudy day. He slept with their calls, and before long he would awaken if they didn't call at all. Before dawn, just as gray light began to filter through the trees, the daybirds began to sing. They started slowly, but before the gray had become light enough to see 10 yards, all the birds started to sing, and Brian was brought out of his sleep by what seemed to be 1,000 singing birds. At first, it all seemed to be noise, but as he learned and listened, he found them all to be different. Robins had an evening song, and one they sang right before a rainstorm, and there would be another one that they would sing right before rain was done. Blue jays spent their time complaining and swearing, but they also warned him. They warned him when something or anything was moving in the woods. Ravens and crows were the same, scrawking and cawing their way through the trees. It was all, Brian found, about territory. Everybody wanted to own a place to live, or a place to hunt. Birds didn't sing just for fun. They sang to warn other birds to keep away. They sang to tell them to stay out of my territory. He had learned about property from the wolves. Several times he had seen a solitary wolf, a large male, that came near the camp, and that large male wolf would study him. The wolf didn't seem to be afraid, and nothing didn't certainly didn't seem to be scared by Brian. Brian even thought of him as kind of a friend. The wolf seemed to come around on a regular schedule, hunting, and Brian guessed that he ran a kind of circuit. At night, while gazing at the fire, Brian figured that if the wolf made 5 miles an hour and he hunted 10 hours a day, he must be doing about a 100-mile loop. After a month or so, the wolf brought a friend, or smaller, younger male. And the second time, they both stopped near Brian's camp. And while Brian watched, they went to the bathroom on a rotten stump. Twice, in the same spot. Brian had read about how wolves, and he had seen films about them, knowing that they left their sign using urine to mark their territory. He also read, or he thought somewhere in a book by Farley Mowat, that the wolves respected each other's territory as well as their own. As soon as they were well away from the old stump, Brian went up and went to the bathroom on it and left his own sign. 5 days later, when they came through again, Brian saw them stop, and they smell where he had gone, and the spot on the ground next to Brian's spot, accepting Brian's boundary. I don't recommend that, folks. Good, he thought. I own something now. I belong. And he had gone on with his life, believing that the wolves, gone on with his life, believing that the wolves and he had settled everything. But wolves rule, and Brian's rule, they only apply just to them. Then the bear came. Brian had come to know bears as well as he knew wolves or birds. They were usually alone, unless it was a female with cubs. If it was a female with cubs, they would be totally devoted to just eating. He had seen them several times while picking berries. They would rake the bushes with their teeth, and they'd pull fruit off. And it was a good number of leaves that they pulled too. which they spit out right before swallowing the berries. As with the wolves, they seemed to get along with him. That is to say, Brian would see them eating, and Brian would move away and let them pick whatever they wanted, and he would find another location. Well, it worked for the bears, he thought, smiling, and it worked for him, and this thinking evolved into what Brian thought of was an understanding between him and the bears. Since he left them alone, they would leave him alone. Unfortunately, the bears didn't know about this special agreement, and Brian was suffering under the misunderstanding that some imaginary politically correct society everything worked out. All of this made him totally unprepared for the reality of the woods. To wit, bears and wolves did what they wanted to do. Brian was the one who had to fit in. He was literally awakened by those facts one morning during a 2-week warm spell. Brian was sleeping soundly, and he woke to the clunking sound of metal on a rock. His mind and ears were tuned to all the natural sounds around him, and there was no sound in nature of where a metal banged on stone. It snapped him awake. He was sleeping with his head in the opening of the shelter, and he had his face out when he opened his eyes, and he saw what appeared to be a wall of black-brown fur directly in front of him. He thought he might be dreaming, and he shook his head, but it didn't go away. And he realized in the same moment that he was looking at the rear end of a bear. You heard it. Rear end of a bear. No, he thought with the clinical logic that surprised him. I'm looking at the very large rear end of a bear. That is very large. The bear had come to Brian's camp and had smelled the gut smell of a dead rabbit and the cooking odor from the pot. The bear didn't see Brian's camp as Brian's territory because there was a food smell. This bear was hungry, and it was time for the bear to eat. It found the pot and the knife by the fire where Brian left them, and it scooped them outside. Brian washed them both in the lake when he finished eating, but the smell of the food was still in the air. Working around the side of the opening, the bear had bumped the pan against a rock at the same moment that it settled its rump in the entrance of Brian's shelter. Brian pulled back his foot. He said, "Hey, get out of here." And he yelled, and he kicked the bear in the rear end. He was not certain what he expected to accomplish by that. Perhaps the bear would turn and realize its mistake and then just sheepishly trundle away. Or the bear, maybe it would run off. With no hesitation, not even the smallest part of a second, the bear turned around and ripped the entire log shelter Brian had built with one sweep of a front paw, and a moist woof coming out of its nostrils. Now Brian saw himself looking at the front of the bear. Turned down now, and the bear was looking at him. And with another snort, the bear swung its left paw and scooped Brian out of the hollow of the rock and flung him over 20 feet in the air. Then the bear slipped forward and used both front paws to pack Brian in a kind of a ball and whap him down to the edge of the water, where Brian just lay there dazed and thinking in some way that he was still back in his shelter. The bear stopped. It studied Brian for a long minute. Then it turned back to ransacking his camp. It was looking for that delicious smell and where it was coming from. It sat back on its haunches and felt the air with its nostrils, located another faint odor stream, and it followed it down to the edge of the water where the fish pool lay. By the fish pool, it dug in the water. Not more than 10 feet from where Brian was laying, very still, trying not to move and to figure out if his arms and legs were all in one piece. Brian saw the bear pull up the rabbit's skull. The rabbit's skull had tiny bits of meat on it. The bear swallowed the thing whole. It dug around in the water again and found guts, and it ate them. And it went back to rummaging around into the little fish pool. When it couldn't find anything, the bear looked once more at Brian, once more at the camp, and waddled away without looking back. Other than some minor scratches, the bear's claws had slightly scraped him. It was more of that boxing action than a clawing one. Brian was in one piece. He was still jolted. He was confused. He didn't know which way was up, but most of all, he was grateful to be alive. He knew that the bear could have done much more damage than it had. He had seen a bear tear the stump out of a ground like it was pulling a tooth, but it was looking at the time for grub worms and ants. This bear could just as easily killed him, but it held back. As for the day, Brian found himself stiffening up, and by the time he was ready for bed, his whole body ached, and he knew he'd be covered with bruises from that encounter. He would have to find some way to protect himself. He needed a weapon. The fire worked well when it was burning, but it had burned down. His hatchet and knife would have done nothing more than make the bear very angry. He didn't want to think about that, and his bow was only good for small game. He never tried to shoot something bigger than a fool bird or rabbit, and he doubted that the bow would have had enough strength about it to kill the bear. All it would have done was make the bear mad. He bundled in his bag that night. In the end of the 2 weeks of warm weather, he kept pushing wood on the fire. He was half afraid that bear would come back, and all the while he tried to think of a solution. But in the reality, the bear was not his primary adversary, nor was the wolf, nor was any other animal. Brian had become his own worst enemy because, in the business of hunting, fishing, and surviving, he forgot the primary rule. Always, and I mean always, pay attention to what's happening around you. Everything in nature means something, and he missed the warning signs that summer was ending. And he missed them in many ways because summer essentially had already ended. And what was coming next would be the most dangerous thing he faced since the crash of the plane. That was the end of chapter 2.